They tell you war is hell, but hell has rules. Hell has boundaries. What I witnessed in the Pacific had neither. My name is Arthur Jenkins. When they shipped me out in '42, I was just another scared kid with a rifle. Private first class, 1st Marine Division. I came back something else. Something that knows the truth about those God-forsaken islands. The truth they'll never print in your newspapers. The truth that still wakes me screaming 40 years later. If you've got the spine for it, if you really want to know what lurked beneath the surface of that war, then listen close. Because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see the world forever. Guadalcanal, August 1942. That's where it started. That's where I first learned that some enemies don't wear uniforms. The heat hit you like a physical force when you stepped off that landing craft. It wrapped around you, invaded your lungs, made every breath a struggle. The jungle wasn't vegetation, it was a living organism that hated us. Every vine wanted to strangle you. Every leaf concealed something that bit, stung, or infected. The Japanese, they were phantoms, sure. Fanatics who'd turned that green hell into their personal killing ground. But even they, and I'd swear this on my mother's grave, even they were afraid of what came out when the sun died. We hit the beach August 7th. The volcanic sand was like nothing I'd ever felt, black as pitch. Hot enough to burn through your boots, shifting and unstable like it wanted to swallow you whole. Command promised us a quick victory. Command lied. From that first step onto that cursed shore, we weren't fighting men anymore. We were fighting the island itself. And the island was winning. Our uniforms rotted off our backs within days. Our skin became a landscape of festering sores and fungal infections. The salt and fear became a permanent taste, coating your mouth like copper pennies. I remember the first time I realized something was fundamentally wrong with that place. It was our 3rd night on the island. I was sharing a foxhole with a kid named Peterson, farm boy from Iowa. Barely 18, still had acne. He was telling me about his girl back home when he just stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide, staring at something behind me. I turned, rifle ready, but there was nothing there. Just jungle. But Peterson kept staring, his mouth moving soundlessly, tears streaming down his face. He reached out toward the empty air, whispered, "Mama," and then collapsed. When the medics checked him, they said his heart had just stopped. No reason. No wounds. Like something had reached inside and switched him off. That was the first. It wouldn't be the last. Henderson Field was our target. Every yard we gained cost blood. The Japanese would come at night, sometimes screaming their banzai charges, sometimes silent as death itself, sliding through our lines like smoke. You learned to sleep with your finger on the trigger. Learn that every shadow could hide a blade. Fear became your constant companion, your sixth sense. But then came the other things. The things that made a Japanese bayonet charge seem almost comforting in its humanity. The damage was too deliberate, too intelligent. Ammunition vanishing from sealed crates without a single lock being broken. Then Private Miller, tough kid from Oklahoma, found at his post in a state I'll never forget. Not asleep, not dead, something in between. His eyes were open but empty, like someone had reached in and pulled out his soul. When he finally came around 12 hours later, he couldn't stop shaking. Said something had pressed down on him, something massive and invisible, draining him. The medics called it combat fatigue. But I saw his eyes. That wasn't fatigue. That was the look of a man who'd glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. Miller tried to tell us what he'd seen during those lost hours. He said he'd been somewhere else, not physically, but his consciousness had been pulled into a place that wasn't a place. A vast darkness filled with things that had never been born and could never die. They'd examined him, he said, like scientists studying a specimen. They'd whispered to him in languages that predated speech, shown him visions of the world before humans, when different things ruled. He drew pictures obsessively after that, spirals and angles that hurt to look at, creatures with too many joints bending the wrong ways. 3 nights later, Miller walked into the jungle and never came back. We found his drawings arranged in a perfect circle where he'd been standing watch. Not jungle sounds, I'd gotten used to those. This was different, a susurration that seemed to rise from the earth itself, speaking in tongues that predated language. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling your head with images of things that had never been and should never be. Our platoon sergeant, Davies, 20 years in the Corps, tough as boiled leather, even he couldn't hide his fear. "Jungle plays tricks," he'd say, but his knuckles were white on his rifle, and he'd stop sleeping altogether. We all felt it. Eyes that weren't eyes, presence that wasn't presence. Something patient and ancient and hungry, always hungry, studying us like we were specimens in a jar. The local natives we encountered, the few who hadn't fled when the war came, they knew something. They wouldn't come near certain parts of the island, wouldn't even look in those directions. One old man, his skin like leather, his eyes milky with cataracts, grabbed my arm once when I was on patrol. He spoke in broken English, his voice urgent. "You wake the old ones. They sleep long time, but blood wake them. Too much blood. They hungry now. They remember the time before. They want it back." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and disappeared into the jungle. Later, I learned his village had been abandoned for 3 generations. No one could explain how he'd been there at all. The canopy above us was so thick it created perpetual twilight. When sunlight did break through, it created dancing shadows that played with your sanity. Every tree trunk became a lurking figure. Every root system looked like grasping hands. The air itself was hostile, thick with rot and decay, and that metallic tang of fierce sweat that never left your nostrils. Your senses became both hyper-alert and completely unreliable. You couldn't trust your eyes, your ears, nothing. Reality itself became negotiable. My turn on watch came during a monsoon. The rain fell like hammers, turning the world into a gray blur of water and mud. I was crouched in my foxhole, a pond of filthy water up to my waist, when I saw it. At first, just movement at the tree line. Then it resolved into a shape that my brain refused to process. Impossibly tall, grotesquely thin, moving with a fluidity that violated the laws of physics. It didn't walk, it flowed, like oil given form, sliding between the trees as if the laws of solid matter didn't apply to it. My voice came out as a croak. "Halt! Who goes there?" It stopped, turned, and though it had no face I could see, I felt its attention like ice water in my veins. The thing regarded me with an intelligence older than civilization, older than humanity itself. Then the whispering exploded in my skull, not heard but felt, crawling through my brain like maggots, speaking truths that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. I emptied my entire clip into it, 8 rounds of 30 to 06, point blank. The muzzle flashes showed me glimpses of something that shouldn't exist, angles that hurt to perceive, a form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. Then nothing, just rain and my own terrified breathing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found the next morning. Where the thing had stood, the vegetation had changed. The leaves were wrong, too many veins, arranged in patterns that looked almost like writing. The bark on the trees had developed growths that pulsed faintly, like tumors with heartbeats. And in the mud were footprints, if you could call them that. They were more like holes in reality, places where the ground simply ceased to exist. Perfectly smooth voids that went down further than they should. Water didn't fill them. Light didn't penetrate them. They were absences, wounds in the world. We avoided that area after that, but sometimes, on patrol, we'd find more of those holes. Always in sets of 3, always arranged in triangular patterns, always perfectly, impossibly deep. Davies and the squad found me like that, still pulling the trigger on an empty rifle. No evidence. No tracks. Nothing. "Heat's getting to you, Jenkins," Davies said, but his voice shook. Because the next morning Thompson was gone. Not taken gone. His foxhole was undisturbed, his rifle clean and loaded, his boots still laced. He'd simply ceased to exist, edited out of reality like he'd never been. Command wrote it up as desertion. We knew better. The island had claimed him, and we all knew we could be next. After Thompson vanished, the dynamic changed. We stopped pretending it was just the Japanese we were fighting. We slept in shifts, always two men watching, not for enemy soldiers but for the shapes between the trees, the whispers in the dark, the things that shouldn't be. Every man developed his own rituals, his own ways of warding off whatever stalked us. Some carved symbols they claimed to have dreamed. Others whispered prayers to gods they'd never believed in before. We were losing our minds, but at least we were still alive. Most of us. Corporal Jackson, a tough Irish kid from Boston, started keeping a journal of the things we saw. He documented everything, the sounds, the sightings, the disappearances, the way reality seemed to bend in certain places. He mapped the areas where men vanished, where the whispers were loudest, where the jungle itself seemed wrong. The patterns he found were disturbing. The incidents weren't random. They followed ley lines, he said, invisible paths of power that crisscrossed the island. The Japanese fortifications, he realized, had been built to avoid these lines. They knew, they'd always known. We were the only ones stupid enough to camp right on top of them. The worst night came during another storm. I was alone in my hole, the rain creating a curtain of white noise that masked everything else. Then, clear as if someone was sitting next to me, a voice spoke. Not the alien whisper's perfect, articulated English, with an accent I couldn't place, ancient and refined. You are trespassers here. You will feed the island before you leave. All of you will feed it. I erupted from that foxhole like I was on fire, screaming, firing into the darkness. My light swept across nothing but rain and jungle. But I knew, God help me, I knew that voice had been real. And it had been right. We didn't belong there. We were intruders in something's domain, and it would extract its price in blood and sanity. I survived Guadalcanal's battles, but part of me never left that jungle. It's still there, in that dark space between the trees, listening to whispers that promise truths too terrible for human comprehension. You have to understand, each island in the Pacific was its own circle of hell, with its own demons, its own hungry darkness. What happened on Guadalcanal was just the beginning. Every beach we stormed, every jungle we entered, we were trespassing on ground that belonged to things far older than Japan or America. Things that had been sleeping until our war woke them up. And once awakened, they were ravenous. New Guinea was next. If Guadalcanal was hell's anteroom, New Guinea was the throne room itself. The jungle there wasn't just alive, it was carnivorous. It actively consumed you, inch by inch, thought by thought. The mountains rose like broken teeth, shrouded in mist that never lifted. The rain was biblical, transforming the ground into a sucking mire that could swallow a man whole. Disease was everywhere, malaria that gave you fever dreams of impossible cities, dengue that made you pray for death, infections that turned minor scratches into rotting horrors. But the diseases were merciful compared to what we found in the deep jungle. The Kokoda track, that's where I learned that some paths should never be walked. We were pushing through, trying to cut off Japanese supply lines. The track was a nightmare, even without the enemy, a ribbon of mud and misery that climbed mountains and plunged into valleys filled with clouds. Men would disappear in that fog, and when it cleared, we'd find them changed. Not physically, mentally. They'd speak in languages they didn't know, draw symbols they'd never seen, have memories that weren't theirs. One kid, Private Morrison, came back from a fog bank speaking fluent Japanese. Not just phrases fluent, accentless Japanese. He'd never studied it, never heard more than banzai before, but now he could read their documents, understand their radio chatter. The intelligence boys were thrilled until Morrison started screaming about the things the Japanese were running from, the things that were driving them toward us. He said both armies were being herded, pushed together like cattle toward a slaughter. For what purpose, he couldn't say, or wouldn't. They shipped him out after he tried to burn every map in headquarters, screaming that we were walking into a trap that had been set before humans learned to speak. 6 of us on reconnaissance. All veterans now, all survivors of Guadalcanal. We thought we'd seen the worst. We were wrong. We were cutting through virgin jungle, every step a battle against nature itself. Then the smell hit us sweet and corrupt, like flowers growing from a corpse. It got stronger as we pushed forward, until it was so thick you could taste it, coating your throat with the flavor of decay. Davies, somehow still alive, still leading us, stopped dead. "This ain't right," he muttered. And he was right. The jungle ahead had changed. The trees were wrong, twisted into impossible spirals, their bark black and wet-looking, pulsing faintly like they had veins. The very air shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. It was like stepping into someone else's nightmare, where the rules of reality no longer applied. We found the clearing, though found implies we were looking for it. It drew us in, pulled us forward against our better judgment. The trees hadn't been cut, they'd been pushed aside by something massive, their trunks splintered and weeping a dark sap that smelled of copper. And in the center stood a structure that hurt to look at. Black stone that seemed to absorb light, covered in carvings that writhed and shifted when you weren't looking directly at them. The bones at its base were fresh, some still had uniforms clinging to them. Japanese, American, others that looked older, much older, with skulls that weren't quite the right shape for humans. But what haunts me most about that place wasn't what we saw, it was what we felt. The structure was broadcasting something, transmitting on a frequency that bypassed your ears and went straight to your primitive brain. It was showing us things, visions of the world before humans, when different intelligences ruled. Cities of impossible architecture beneath the waves. Things with wings that weren't quite dragons, circling mountains that touched the stars. And throughout it all, a presence, watching, waiting, hungry for the world to return to that state. We were seeing history that had been erased, forgotten, deliberately hidden. And we were seeing the future. They planned a world where humanity was just a food, source for things that had been patient for millions of years. "Mother of God," Davies whispered. The structure was humming, a subsonic vibration that you felt in your bones, in your teeth, in the fluid of your eyes. Private Miller, different Miller, the first one never came back from Guadalcanal, started screaming that the symbols were moving, crawling like living things. He was right. They were spelling out words, but in no language that should exist. Then the structure began to open. Not like a door, like an eye, like a wound. Green light poured out, thick and viscous, and with it came a sound that wasn't quite screaming and wasn't quite singing. It was the sound of something vast and ancient, awakening after eons of sleep, something that had been waiting for the blood we'd spilled to seep deep enough into the earth to reach it. Miller broke first, threw down his rifle and ran, shrieking into the jungle. We never saw him again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, we could hear him screaming in the distance for days afterward, long past when he should have died from exposure. The thing that emerged from that structure wasn't solid. It was a writhing mass of green luminescence that moved like smoke given malevolent purpose. It reached for us with appendages that weren't quite tentacles, weren't quite arms, weren't quite anything that belonged in our world. Davies ordered us to fire, but our bullets passed through it like shooting at fog. It kept coming, and where it touched the ground, the earth itself began to change, transforming into that same black, pulsing substance as the trees. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the jungle, leaving everything behind. When we finally stopped, miles away, gasping and retching, we were changed. The thing had marked us somehow. I could feel it in my mind, a cold presence that had taken up residence in the dark corners of my thoughts. Command didn't believe us, sent another patrol to investigate. They never came back. A third patrol found no trace of the clearing, the structure, or the missing men. The jungle had swallowed it all. Or maybe it had never wanted to be found by anyone else. Maybe it had gotten what it wanted from us, our fear, our sanity, a few lives to feed its endless hunger. But I know it's still there, waiting in that twisted clearing, growing stronger on the blood and terror of war. Let me tell you about the Philippines. Leyte Gulf, October 1944. We thought we were liberating the islands, but we were really just opening doors that should have stayed closed. The Filipinos had stories, older than Spanish colonization, about things that lived in the deepest parts of the jungle, in the caves beneath the mountains. The Japanese had found some of those places. We found what was left of them. There was a village near our position, abandoned for decades. The locals wouldn't say why, just crossed themselves and muttered prayers when we asked. We set up a command post there anyway. Stone buildings offered better protection than tents. That first night, we heard the drums. Not native drums, not Japanese drums, something else. A rhythm that seemed to come from underground, a beat that matched no human heart. The sound did things to you, made your blood feel thick, made your thoughts sluggish. 3 men went missing that night. We found them the next morning in the old church, arranged in a circle, their eyes gone, their mouths open in silent screams. They were still alive technically, but whatever made them human had been extracted. They died within hours, but not before one of them grabbed my hand and whispered, "They're underneath." They've always been underneath, waiting for the blood to flow down. We found the entrance 2 days later, a hole beneath the church altar, old beyond measure, carved with symbols that predated any culture we knew. The smell coming from it was indescribable, rot and sulfur and something else, something like burnt copper. We could hear things moving down there, wet sounds, dragging sounds, and underneath it all, that drumming. Always the drumming. Command wanted us to explore it, but Davies, God bless him, refused. Said he'd face court-martial before he sent men down there. That night, something came up instead. I was on watch when the ground started to bubble around the hole. Not violently, just a slow, steady percolation, like thick soup coming to a boil. Then hands emerged, but calling them hands is generous. They had too many joints, too many fingers, and they moved with a horrible intelligence. Whatever was climbing out had been human once, maybe centuries ago, but the things below had changed it, improved it for their purposes. It looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much hunger, and it smiled with a mouth that opened sideways. I emptied my rifle into it, and it just laughed a sound, like breaking glass before sliding back into the hole. We poured concrete over that entrance, tons of it, but sometimes, on quiet nights, you could still hear the drumming, and the concrete would crack, just a little, as if something was patiently, persistently pushing from below. Each island brought fresh nightmares. But Iwo Jima, Jesus Christ, Iwo Jima was different. It wasn't just an island. It was a massive grave, 8 square miles of volcanic ash and sulfur, honeycombed with caves that went down to the Earth's burning heart. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress, but they'd also awakened something in those tunnels, something that had been sleeping in the dark for millennia, something that was grateful for the feast we were providing. February 1945, the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. It was like landing on an alien planet, a moonscape of ash and death. Mount Suribachi loomed above us, raining fire. We knew it would be bad. Intelligence said the Japanese had 20,000 men in underground fortifications. Intelligence didn't mention the other things down there, the older things. Cave clearing was the worst duty you could draw. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades, nothing really worked because the caves went on forever, branching and twisting like the root system of some impossible tree. You'd clear a cave, post guards, and find Japanese back in it an hour later. But they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from deeper down, from tunnels that weren't on any map, that couldn't have been dug by human hands. The first sign something was truly wrong came from Rodriguez's squad. They were clearing a tunnel complex when Rodriguez just stopped, frozen in place, his whole body rigid with terror. When I reached him, he was pointing into the darkness with a shaking hand. 2 red eyes floated in the black, unblinking, watching us with an intelligence that was definitely not human. They were too far apart to belong to any face that should exist. Rodriguez fired first, full auto, the muzzle flash strobing the tunnel. For one horrifying instant, I saw it fully emaciated beyond belief. Skin like wet paper stretched over too many bones, joints that bent in ways that violated anatomy. It clung to the ceiling like a massive spider, but its face, God, its face was almost human. If humans had evolved in the deep places where light never reaches, the mouth opened, revealing rows of needle teeth, and it spoke. Not in words, but directly into our minds. Hungry, so hungry, feed, must feed. It vanished when the firing stopped, melted back into the shadows like it was made of them. Rodriguez was sobbing, crawling backward. His mind cracked like an egg. We sealed that tunnel with explosives and white phosphorus. Command logged it as structurally unstable. But that night, 3 men from our company vanished from their foxholes. We found them the next day, deep in a cave we'd already cleared. They were alive but wrong drained of something essential. Their eyes flat and dead, their bodies withered, like mummies. They died within hours, whispering about the red eyes, about the hunger that never ends. After that, we started seeing them regularly. Always in the deep caves, always watching, always hungry. They moved wrong, skittered through spaces too small for their elongated bodies, appeared and disappeared like smoke. And the sounds they made, not quite breathing, not quite whispering, but something between that spoke directly to the primitive parts of your brain that still remembered what it was like to be prey. But here's what they don't tell you about Iwo Jima. The deeper we went into those caves, the older things got. We found chambers that couldn't have been carved by the Japanese, walls covered in pictographs that showed things that had never walked the earth, or at least not the earth we knew. Star-headed beings descending from the sky, cities beneath the waves, and always, the red-eyed things, depicted as servants or worshippers of something even worse. Something that slept in the deepest parts of the island. Something the volcanic activity was slowly awakening. I had my own encounter 3 nights before we raised the flag. Guard duty in a secured cave. The darkness was absolute, pressing against your eyes like a physical weight. I was fighting to stay awake when I felt breath on my neck, cold, dry, ancient. I turned, and it was there, inches from my face. The red eyes burned like coals, and I could see myself reflected in them not as I was, but as I would be. Drained, hollow, another empty shell left in the caves. It leaned closer, and its voice was like sand over glass. You will feed us. All of you will feed us. The earth demands it. I fired point blank, emptied my sidearm into it. The bullets passed through like it was made of shadow. It smiled, God help me. It smiled, showing those needle teeth, before dissolving back into the dark. I screamed until my throat bled, fired until my rifle was empty, kept pulling the trigger long after. They found me like that at dawn, catatonic, still shooting at shadows. Said it was battle fatigue, sent me to the rear for a day. But there was no rear on Iwo Jima, no escape from the things in the caves. We took that island, raised that famous flag, but we left men down in those caves, not just dead men, but men who were taken, consumed, absorbed into whatever ancient horror dwelt in the deepest places. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, neither living nor dead, feeding the hunger that can never be satisfied. I know the things are still there, waiting in the volcanic darkness, patient as stone, waiting for the next war, the next offering of flesh and fear and blood. Then came Okinawa, April 1945. The last major battle, they called it, the Typhoon of Steel. If Iwo Jima was where things lurked underground, Okinawa was where the boundary between worlds had worn thin. The Okinawans had different stories than the other islands. Stories about the times when the veil lifted, when things from outside could cross over. They called them the Hunger Nights, when the stars aligned wrong and reality became negotiable. We arrived right in the middle of one. The rains on Okinawa were different. They didn't just fall. They seemed to bring things with them. Shapes in the downpour that weren't quite rain, weren't quite solid. Men would go out in those storms and come back, change their memories, scrambled, speaking in languages that didn't exist, their eyes reflecting light like a cat's. The locals hid during these rains, sealed their doors and windows, burned specific incense that hurt your lungs but supposedly kept the things out. We laughed at their superstitions. We stopped laughing after the first hunger night. It happened during a lull in the fighting. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning everything to mud. Then the quality of the rain changed. It became thicker, almost gelatinous, and it glowed faintly green in the darkness. Where it touched bare skin, it burned like acid but left no marks. And in that rain, things moved. Tall figures that walked between the droplets without getting wet. They passed through our perimeter like we weren't there, heading inland toward the ancient tombs the Okinawans had warned us not to disturb. I followed them. God help me, I followed them. Something about that rain, that night, made rational thought impossible. I found myself walking through our lines, past sleeping sentries who didn't see me, following those tall figures into the jungle. They led me to a tomb complex we'd been using as a supply depot. But it had changed. The stones were bleeding, not blood, but something black and viscous that moved with purpose. The figures entered the largest tomb, and I followed. Inside was impossible. The space was larger than the structure that contained it, extending down into darkness that seemed to go on forever. The walls were covered in writing that hurt to read, symbols that rearranged themselves when you looked away. And at the center was a pit, perfectly circular, perfectly black, with something massive moving at the bottom. The tall figures stood at the edge, chanting in harmonics that human throats couldn't produce, and from the pit rose a sound like the earth itself groaning. I watched. God forgive me. I watched as they began throwing things into the pit. Not objects, concepts. They pulled ideas out of the air, hope, memory, love, and fed them to whatever was down there. With each feeding, the thing below grew stronger, its presence expanding, reaching up toward our world. I understood then what they were doing. They were feeding it the things that made us human, preparing us for something worse than death, preparing us to be hollow vessels for something else to inhabit. I ran through that impossible rain, ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When dawn came, I was back at our perimeter, soaked and shaking. The tomb complex was just a tomb complex again, filled with our supplies, untouched. But 17 men were missing. They were never found. And those who'd been on watch that night all reported the same dream of vast darkness rising from below, and voices promising that the war was just the beginning, that humanity's time was ending, that something else was preparing to reclaim the earth. The ocean held its own terrors. This story comes from Bobby Hayes, a radio man on the destroyer USS Vigilant. I met him in a field hospital on Okinawa. He was being treated for complete nervous breakdown, at least that's what they called it. But when you looked in his eyes, you could see he'd witnessed something that had broken a fundamental part of his understanding of the world. He told me this story in whispers, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if afraid the ocean itself might hear him. The Central Pacific is the loneliest place on Earth, thousands of miles of nothing but water so deep it might as well be infinite. Bobby was monitoring the radio when they picked up the signal, not a distress call, not enemy traffic, but something else. A pattern of clicks and harmonics that sounded almost like whale song, but too structured, too deliberate. It was coming from directly beneath them, from depths that nothing should be able to survive. The captain ordered them to investigate. As they tracked it, the signal grew stronger, more complex, resolving into something almost like music if music could be threatening. Their sonar operator reported a massive contact rising from the deep, larger than any submarine, any whale, anything that should exist. "It's the size of a city block," he whispered, "and it's singing." Then their instruments started dying. Compass spinning wildly, engines stuttering, lights failing one by one. The singing grew louder, bypassing the ears to resonate directly in their bones. It was hauntingly beautiful and utterly wrong, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human, but was trying to mimic one. Men started acting strange. Some wept uncontrollably. Others stood transfixed at the rail, swaying in time with the melody. Several jumped overboard before anyone could stop them, diving toward the song with expressions of terrible joy. The water around them began to glow with bioluminescence, but not the gentle green they knew. This was sickly yellow, pulsing in rhythm with the song. In that light, they could see shapes moving beneath the surface, long, serpentine things with too many joints, propelling themselves with appendages that weren't quite fins, weren't quite tentacles. They circled the ship in a complex pattern, like they were performing some ritual, preparing for something. Then it surfaced. Not completely, Bobby said. If it had shown itself fully, every man on that ship would have gone irreversibly insane. What they saw was enough. A head the size of a building, covered in scales that weren't scales but something like living metal, reflecting and distorting everything around it. Eyes like yellow suns, ancient beyond measure, filled with an intelligence that preceded human evolution by eons. And the mouth, God, the mouth was opening, revealing not teeth but what looked like entire cities of bone, architectural impossibilities that hurt to perceive. The singing reached a crescendo that shattered glass, burst eardrums, drove men to their knees screaming. Bobby said he could feel it trying to rewrite his thoughts, to make him want to walk into that mouth, to become part of something vast and terrible and eternal. Just as the creature prepared to consume them whole, another destroyer appeared, firing everything they had. The shells did nothing to the creature, but they disrupted its song, broke its concentration. It submerged with a roar that was heard for miles, creating a whirlpool that nearly dragged both ships down. The water where it had been glowed for hours afterward, and dead things floated to the surface, fish with too many eyes, squids with human-like hands, things that shouldn't exist outside of fever dreams. Command classified the entire incident, threatened court-martial for anyone who spoke of it. But Bobby couldn't forget, couldn't stop hearing that song in quiet moments, calling him back to the deep. "It's still down there," he told me, tears streaming down his face. "Waiting in the deepest trenches. It's been there since before the continents formed, and it'll be there long after we're gone." So fucking patient. These stories, these fragments of impossible truth, they're all I have left of the men who didn't make it back, or who made it back but left their sanity on those islands. Every veteran of the Pacific carries these shadows, whether they admit it or not. We came back changed, infected with the knowledge that our world is far stranger and more terrible than anyone imagines. The war didn't end in 1945. Not really. We just stopped feeding the islands, stopped bleeding into the ocean, stopped providing the sustenance those ancient things required. But here's what truly terrifies me, the patterns. When you put all these encounters together, when you map them out, you see it. These weren't random events. They were coordinated, synchronized. The things on Guadalcanal, in New Guinea, under Iwo Jima, in the depths of the Pacific, they were all connected, all part of something larger. The war didn't wake them individually. It woke a network, a civilization, an entire ecosystem of nightmare that exists parallel to our own. And they were testing us, probing our defenses, learning our weaknesses. The atomic bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, people think they ended the war. Maybe they did. But I've talked to men who were there for the occupation, and they tell stories too. Stories about shadows burned into walls that moved when no one was looking. About voices in the radiation zones, speaking languages that predated Japanese. About things that fed on the atomic fire that grew stronger from our most powerful weapons. We didn't end anything with those bombs. We just announced ourselves to something bigger. I've spent 40 years trying to make sense of what I saw, what we all saw. I've read every book on the occult, every mythology, every forbidden text I could get my hands on. And the more I learn, the more I realize how little we understand. These things, they're mentioned in every culture, every religion, hidden in metaphor and allegory. The titans imprisoned beneath the earth, the Rakshasa, the Nephilim, the Old Ones. Different names for the same truth that we are not alone, have never been alone, and that our time at the top of the food chain is borrowed. The Pacific War was sold to us as a fight for freedom, for democracy, against the forces of tyranny. And it was. But it was also something else, a mass human sacrifice to things that should have stayed sleeping. We poked at wounds in the earth that should never have been opened, and we let out things that had been contained for good reason. The atomic bombs that ended the war, maybe they weren't just about defeating Japan. Maybe someone, somewhere knew what we'd awakened and decided that overwhelming force was the only way to make those things go back to sleep. But they're not sleeping. Not really. They're waiting. Every earthquake in the Pacific, every tsunami, every volcanic eruption, it's them, stirring, testing the bars of their prison. And one day, when the stars align right, when enough blood has been spilled, when humanity has grown complacent and forgotten the old warnings, they'll rise again. And this time, we won't have the excuse of ignorance. This time, we'll know exactly what's coming for us. So when you thank a veteran, When you remember the fallen, remember this too. We didn't just fight the enemy. We fought the darkness itself, the crawling chaos that waits just beyond the edge of what you call reality. And we're still fighting it, those of us who remain, in our dreams, in our memories, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the shadows seem to move on their own. I'm an old man now. My hands shake, my memory fades, but these stories burn as bright as the day they happened. I tell them not to frighten you, but to warn you, to prepare you. Because the signs are all there if you know how to look. The increasing deep-sea activity, the missing ships, the sonar contacts that naval commands classify and bury. The things washing up on beaches that marine biologists can't identify. The rise in missing persons near old battlefield sites. It's starting again. Share this story if you dare. Comment if you've heard similar tales from veterans in your own family. Though I warn you, once you start looking for these stories, you'll find them everywhere. Hidden in the gaps of official histories, whispered in VFW halls, scrawled in journals that families burn rather than read. The truth is out there, waiting to be acknowledged. But be careful what you wish for. Some knowledge can't be unlearned. Some doors once opened can never be closed. And remember this, they're still out there, still hungry, still watching. They remember us. They remember the feast we gave them. They remember the fear, the blood, the souls they claimed. And they're waiting with infinite patience for the next one. The next war, the next catastrophe, the next opportunity to break through. Because war never changes. But the things that feed on war, they're evolving, learning, growing stronger, and one day when humanity least expects it, when we've convinced ourselves these were just the delusions of shell-shocked soldiers, they'll remind us that some enemies never signed a peace treaty, some enemies never surrendered, some enemies have been here long before us and will be here long after we're gone. The Pacific War ended in 1945, but the real war, the war between our world and theirs, between light and the hungry darkness, that war never ended. We just learned to stop looking at it. But it's still there, raging in the spaces between spaces, in the depths beneath depths, in the shadows that shouldn't exist. And every veteran who came back from those islands carries a piece of that war with them, a fragment of forbidden knowledge that gnaws at their sanity. I've told you my story. I've warned you. What you do with this knowledge is up to you. But remember, once you know, once you truly understand what lurks beneath the surface of our world, you can never unknow it. You'll see the signs everywhere. You'll hear the whispers in the static. You'll feel the eyes watching from the dark. And you'll understand why some of us never really came home from the Pacific. Part of us is still there, fighting a war that never ended, against an enemy that never dies. Sweet dreams, if you can still have them.